Anybody in the mood for some crispy critters? I wanted to introduce you guys to a motor swap car that I got brought in. The condition was that sometimes it will start, sometimes it won't start, and then it will just die. And battery was stone cold dead in it, managed to get it to start, but as soon as you start it, after about 30 seconds it dies. I data logged it, and it will lose the RPM signal. And I've been working on it off and on for over a week now because I had a couple days before I could get to it, finally got to it, worked on it, found the problem, had to call the customer, had to order parts, wait for those parts, got it finished up last night, was doing one final once over of everything, and found another problem, which I'll cover in the video as well. This guy right here with the race car, he's actually pretty hooked into this world locally. And he's got a bunch of friends in the race car world, and apparently this guy's had some other people look at it, they couldn't fix it, and the guy that originally did the motor swap was telling him, oh, I don't have time for you, it'll be 6 months before I can get you in. So got a recommendation from my race car buddy here to look at this guy's car. So I really appreciate the recommendation. Word of mouth is huge in this business, so I'm trying to get this car fixed up right. But that's the situation with this car, and that's how I wound up with this car, on top of all the other work that I'm doing, kind of doing a favor for a friend of a friend. This video is going to be about diagnosing it and some of the pitfalls of motor swaps. So stay tuned, you're going to learn a lot if you watch this whole video. This black Pontiac right here is 2000 Trans Am. They came with a 5.7. And this guy, I'm pretty sure he told me he has an LS2 swapped into it. I'm pretty sure it's a 6-liter. Remember, it was an LS2 or an LS3. It's a very quick exchange. He's, got a lot of things he was doing, so he dropped it off and ran off. But the reason I wanted to take a second and talk to you guys about this is, so I have been only doing this for about 6 months now, full time, for 10 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever it is. And I've seen a whole bunch of motor swap cars. That race car is a motor swap car. This is a motor swap car. I just did a session, a dyno session, where a guy rented my dyno. He had an RX-7 motor swap car. That red truck out there, that red truck came with a 4.8. It got swapped to a 6-liter. And they all, I've seen a bunch of these things. They all have the same exact theme. And one of those themes is that there's a lot of stuff that is not clear when you go to start working on it, because if your car has a problem, you can't Google, hey, 2000 Pontiac Trans Am problem, because how do you know it's not coming from the motor swap? And if it is coming from the motor swap, how do you Google motor swap whatever? It's a challenge. So if you're going to motor swap your car, you need to be prepared that it is going to be expensive and a headache over the long term to have that vehicle. You're going to have to be not only inventive to get it into the car, but you're going to be inventive to maintain that car. Case in point, I'm going to take you up underneath here so you can see a couple of things. I'm also going to show you a couple of things underneath the hood. And this is a good example, but that red truck has the problem. This race car has a problem. All the motor swap cars that I ever see have this problem. Okay, so the lighting is not that great, but so this is a very common thing I see. Wires are always just left dangling. And worse than that, like this. There's a plug there. There's another plug. There's probably 15 different plugs underneath this car that are just there. That is a knock sensor. It has nothing plugged into it, which means that the computer is not using knock to retard timing. I have no idea why you would unplug knock sensors. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. Especially in a hot application like this where it's got a cam and all kinds of stuff. The leaks, that's common. I mean, that's just cars leak. That's not a big deal. It's really the wiring that I'm starting to see. Okay, this has a different starter than it came with from the factory. And that is, I'm pretty sure, the signal from the, what do you call it, the key to activate the starter. I have no idea why you would leave your ABS sensor hanging down like that. Just a lot of things. And this, I mean, there's more wires that are just kind of flopping around. It's a very common thing that I see on these motor swaps. Let me take you up top. Okay, so now we're on top of the car, and again, another plug. I have no idea where it goes or what it does. I didn't do the motor swap. Is that the problem? Why this car starts up and then dies? I don't know. Then there's this box right here. This is the trigger box that changes down to a 24x so that this old style computer can see it. The wires are just run everywhere. So the main power wire for this guy goes all the way down over here. It's up underneath the battery. It's getting squished by the battery. It comes around over here, comes out over here, and it is plugged into this fuse box. Well, here's how it's plugged into the fuse box. And I did not do that, but I needed to make sure that the car, that trigger box was actually getting power over there. So that could be a problem. As far as I can tell, the Lingenfelter box is working fine. It doesn't give any error codes. What I really suspect the problem is just his crank sensor, because what happens, I data logged it, you start it up, it runs fine, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it loses RPM signal. And that is almost always these sensors. And he said he's put a brand new one in it. Well, this one is made in China, which, you know, China, that's not necessarily the problem. That just tells me this is not a GM part. And I've seen this problem a couple of times. I've had this problem a couple of times on the dyno where these LS motors, those crank position sensors are delicate, I guess, and the only ones that seem to stand the test of time are the factory General Motors crank position sensors. So what I've actually got this thing unplugged. It was soaked in oil. The wiring that goes down to the sensor was soaked in oil, and that is another problem that I've seen, is these sensors don't like oil on them at all. So what I'm gonna do is pull the wire that goes to that sensor, try to fish it out of the engine bay, and clean all the oil off of it, take the connector apart and clean all the oil off of that, and then I'm gonna go to the GM dealership and get a crank position sensor and put that in there, and we'll see if that's what actually fixes it. The problem is I can't really diagnose it with a scan tool or anything like that because of that Lingenfelter box. Even though the Lingenfelter box doesn't have any error code showing, it still could be faulty and there's no test method for it. But I don't want to, you know, just throw a Lingenfelter box. Those things are $300 and something. I don't want to just throw that on there hoping that's the problem. But it definitely has an oil leak. And I'm pretty sure it's coming from the valve cover gaskets. But, you know, he's not in for an oil leak, so I'm not going to try to solve the oil leak. I'm going to try to solve the cranking position problem and then let him know about these other things that I found. Another thing that just kind of bugs me about motor swaps is there's things like this. Like, what the heck does that do? I think it's from the charcoal canister, but I don't know. I didn't do it. You know, his PVC valve is just left open, and it's clearly causing oil leak somewhere. Like, if you don't spend tons and tons of money on a motor swap, this is what you get. Man, unless you have somebody who really has an attention to detail, it just, I've yet to see a motor swap turn out like pristine, like I would have done it that way. And I'm not knocking shops. I mean, the car runs and drives, but I don't know. I guess I'm just way too particular. This kind of stuff bothers me because then I don't know, where do I stop, you know? Do I just focus on the problem? And then if I only focus on the problem he brought it in for, what if something else goes wrong? And then he says, hey dude, I took it to you and I paid you to fix my car and this other thing, even though they're completely unrelated. like I'm still trying to find that balance. And so the best thing I have found to let me sleep at night is I make the customer sign a work order. And what I do in the work order is I put some notes about the car. The car is a whatever. It has a motor swap in it that, you know, and then I also put the customer notes, or from the customer, I'll put notes in that says, you know, customer brought it in because the car won't start and he wants it diagnosed and fixed, whatever. So then I'm kind of agreeing up front before I even touch the car, hey, this is what I'm gonna work on. That doesn't mean I'm gonna fix every problem I find with your car. I'm gonna fix this thing that you brought it in for. But I think if you're gonna motor swap a car, you just need to be prepared. You're gonna have to deal with this, and you're gonna have a shop that you can take it to who will just go through a methodical diagnosis process, because you can't Google this stuff. And that's something I actually used to say when I was an engineer. I designed things and we faced problems you couldn't Google because we were on the cutting edge of technology. We were doing things nobody else had done, so you couldn't Google it. Well, that's kind of what these situations are. You can't Google how to troubleshoot a Lingenfelter box. You know, like it just, and you can't troubleshoot, you can't Google, is it Lingenfelter or is it not Lingenfelter? Is it the motor swap or not the motor swap? You know, so I'm gonna get started on this and go from there. So I got this wire fished out of here and it melted. And he mentioned that whenever the car gets hot, it gives him extra problems. Oil residue all over it. So I'm gonna take this connector apart, try to clean it out. I'm gonna strip this whole loom off of here and make sure nothing is melted and do some continuity testing and things. Peeled the loom back and the wires got hot enough. See up here, everything is nice and colored and separated. And you get down here, the wires actually got discolored. That could be a combination of heat and oil, but it also melted the wires together. So yeah, this one is completely stuck together. Doesn't look like it melted through the wire. We'll just have to see here. So I depinned the connector. I cleaned off all of the oil residue, squirted brake cleaner down in through there, blew everything out with high pressure air, cleaned off all the wires, made sure all the wires are separated, and all the wires look like they're in good shape, all the connectors look like they're in good shape. And then I put some of this thermal sleeve, which is rated to 1200 degrees. As long as it's not touching something that's really hot, it will really make a big difference in protecting these wires from getting hot. I went up as high as, you can see there's kind of like a white powdery residue. So what I did is I went all the way up to where the white powdery residue started, cut the rest of it off, and coated it all in this heat sleeve. Now I'm gonna put it back down through there and try to route it in a way that it's not gonna get next to heat and it's not gonna get melted again. Okay, hold the phone. I'm up under it checking the other side. So there's a wire that goes to there, which is the the crank angle sensor. And then there's a wire that goes to here. I'm sorry, this one right here, which is the input to the computer. And I just started tracing that wire back. And I found right here, same thing. The wires are melted together. I thought, So I peeled it back. These wires are not melted together. And then I suddenly spotted, do you see a problem with this? Anybody? The fact that the wires are literally laying on top of the headers. So now I'm gonna fish it out through the top and see exactly what all is going on here. Anybody in the mood for some crispy critters? Holy smokes, that melted all of the wires. And I would be willing to bet you when I pull this apart, the wires that are melted, these exposed wires right here, are probably the crank position. This is the crankshaft position sensor input to the computer, and all three of the wires for this sensor are all boogered up. These were all tangled up and melted together. Until all of this stuff got really, really melted together, it wouldn't have disturbed it. So I've got to call the customer and figure out, because this is a main leg of the harness, The starter wire here is got a pretty healthy melt on it. I have got to call him and figure out what he wants me to do, and then I'll go from there. The plan now to get all this wiring sorted out is to use fire sleeve to protect it. Now, this is a good close-up of fire sleeve. So there's a healthy amount of fiberglass insulation coated in silicone. So there's a couple wires that are getting completely coated in that. And then that starter wire that's all boogered up is getting replaced with this connector, which is specifically made for this starter. I actually got it from my local Napa. There is the part number. And I'll put in the description down below the General Motors part numbers that I found to look that up. This actually seems to have the starter from an LS1, because whenever I was looking at all the different connectors for the different motor types, the LS1 is the one that had the connector that looked like it worked. That connector plugs straight in, so everything's good. So it is actually going to replace this mess, whatever this is. I'm going to trim it back to here, because this is where it's burnt. So I'm going to cut it here and replace this with that. And then just set about fixing all these wiring. Instead of feeding it all the way down there, and then feeding this guy all the way down there, I'm actually just going to cut this right here at the burned up wires. And I'm going to remove this connector, and I'm just going to connect these straight to each other. I can't think of any reason why he would ever not need this box, because this box is actually what powers the car, like gives the RPM signal. He has to have this box to get the car to run. Lingenfelter's pretty clear not to extend these wires, so I'm going to cut it right at the connector, and then just really do the same thing. Like, this is the O2 sensor. It's got melted wires. I'm just going to cut this bad section out. I'll double check everything before I, finalize it, but that's the plan right now. I was just trucking and almost forgot to show how I'm repairing these wires. So I'm cutting past any of the melted spots or any of the frayed spots, and I'm using crimps and this automotive grade adhesive lined heat shrink. This stuff is pretty stiff, and it actually takes the temperature almost hot enough to melt solder to get it to shrink, and it's a 4-to-1 shrink ratio, so that gets slid over the top of this and then shrunk down, and I shrink it until adhesive squeezes out of the sides. I decided to leave the connector on here because I thought about this. What if this Lingenfelter box goes bad? If that thing goes bad, he'll need to be able to unplug this and then plug something back in. So I dramatically shortened the wires. I cut off, that much of it, about a foot. So at least I can keep it up here. And I've got to clean this up. I just don't like how it's kind of floating around. I haven't figured that out yet, but that's what I'm doing to repair it. Because solder joints are unreliable. Coming from an engineering job where what we did millions and millions and millions of times a year were make hand solder joints, one of our cables would be 16 solder connections on each end. So you'd have 32 handmade solder connections. And one of the biggest things we fought, one of the biggest quality issues we fought my whole 10-year career at that company were soldering issues. Mechanical crimps, in my opinion, for this is a lot better because it's a lot more consistent. So there's only one way to open and close these jaws, which crimp it. As long as you get the bare wire inside there and you crimp it and you give it a tug and it doesn't come loose, it's a valid electrical connection that's not ever going to vibrate loose or anything like that. Got the fire sleeve down in there. I haven't finished running it yet, but that's the factory routing, and that fire sleeve stuff will definitely protect that from getting hot. That's the factory routing. There's actually a tie point to the frame right there that I'm going to use. It's got headers now, so that means it's going to get a little bit hotter. Believe it or not, those cast iron manifolds actually hold a lot of heat inside because they're so thick. Headers are a lot thinner, so they radiate a lot more heat, but I'm going to route everything underneath there so that it's tied to that factory mounting point, but it's in that fire sleeve, so as long as it's not laying over on top of something glowing red, it'll never even remotely come close to melting those. So tidy up a little bit more wiring, and then I'll get you guys underneath. So underneath here, I secured this ABS line so it's not flapping in the wind. I had to actually extend the wire for the oil level, or either oil temperature or oil level, I'm not sure, but had to extend that wiring. And it doesn't need to be heat protected down here. It's nowhere near heat, but all of this stuff is heat protected. It has got that fire sleeve on it, and it's got a steel zip tie on it, holding it to the factory location, and it's not touching the headers, but it is close, but there's not much choice. Got the new connector on the starter, the appropriate connector. I rerouted these lines through that hole in that motor mount because they were actually run up there where they were just about touching the header. Got all of that stuff cleaned up. Was going to do one final check last night and found this. Upon further inspection, the extension harness that goes from the factory O2 sensor plug to the O2 sensor was completely melted. And I spent so much time focused on the passenger side where the crank sensor was and all that other melted wiring was, I didn't even check this side. So last night, before I decided to button up and call it done, I just started checking things one more time, and I found that. So I called the guy, let him know, hey, I found one more thing. Sorry, I thought it was done. Found one more thing. Called and got all that stuff on order. So I'm gonna replace the O2 sensor for sure, because this is a very specific type of wire, and I just don't want to mess with repairing it. It's already old anyway, and it's just, these things are not, this part of it I'm not confident in repairing, especially when these O2 sensors are not all that expensive. So I'm gonna just replace that. And then there's actually a heat shield right there that I'm gonna run it up behind, and then I'll run it down by here and keep it completely away from the heat. And that'll solve that problem. So just show you guys a little bit about how I got it all cleaned up. There's a giant cavity back up in here, so I took all of those loose wires, tucked them in, ran them really nice, and got this guy fixed in place so it's not vibrating. And I put it here because this status light actually indicates whether it's working or not. And according to the Lingenfelter instructions, it will flash a code if there's a fault with the box. So I put it in view and safe, away from heat and everything. So that's fixed in place. Wires are taken care of. This ground wire right here that actually goes to the Lingenfelter box was coiled up like 5 or 6 times and just stuck down in there. And it was also run to this stud right here, but the Lingenfelter instructions say run it directly to the engine head. So I took a new ring terminal, shortened the wire appropriately, and ran it directly to the engine head, just like the instructions say. Tucked the wiring in here, zip tied it in place so it's not going to be any problems. This power wire that runs over here, I zip tied it into this harness right here so that it can't get crushed by the battery again. Ran it over here away from the radiator, and upon further inspection, it was actually crushed by the radiator right in there. So I ran it up over the radiator to get it away from that, and I fixed this that kind of janky antifuse. I actually took a single pin and bent it and got some automotive grade shrink tubing on that. I also drilled a hole through this box so that the wire could come in through there, and then I stuck vacuum tube through the hole to keep it from chafing and also to try to seal it up. I also noticed the fuse that they had run was a 30 amp fuse. The Lingenfelter instructions say to run a 5 amp fuse. The reason for that is if you get some kind of a short, like if you're changing your battery or getting jumped off or something like that, and you get a short in the system, 30 amps will fry that box over there, absolutely fry it. And then you'll never know, like, why won't my car start? I'm trying to jump it off, and you'll cause other problems. So I got the proper weather-sealed antifuse, got it all taken care of, so now it doesn't like poke up through the box. This box had a big giant bow in it from that Adafuse. So now it's weather tight, it's not gonna chafe. I've got the right fuse in there. It's not on top of things it shouldn't be on top of. So I realized at the beginning of this video I was wearing shorts. That was only a week ago. Now I'm bundled up because it suddenly decided to go from 80-degree weather. It's 45 outside right now. That's the weather in Arkansas where I live. But I'm about to start it for the first time after all of the wiring and all of that crap to make sure everything is fine. Seems like a success. I'm gonna let it get up to temperature, turn it off, turn it on, a bunch of times, drive it around the block, make sure everything's good. I'm about 99.99% sure that's what the problems were. Let's let it close out on a very nice LS motor cam sound.